So we have quite a few people. It's 1 p.m. We'll start with the session, guys. Welcome to the 10th edition of the Hirist Tech Talk, guys. That's right. We're today completing 10 episodes in this series. If you've missed any of our earlier webinars, you can catch them on our YouTube channel. And I'll share the links. I'll share the link of the webinar and our channel in the chat box below. Guys, my name is Vibhor. I'm a part of the marketing team at Hirist.com. And I'm very, very delighted to have all of you join us today again, right on time at 1 p.m., guys. So, guys, we today have the pleasure of conducting the 10th edition of the series in collaboration with codedamn. So, guys, Mehul Mohan, who's the founder of codedamn, will be leading this session today. Guys, Mehul is a full stack developer. He's a WWDC 19 scholar. He's an author of 2 books, and he runs a very successful startup helping people learn how to code with next generation coding practice platform, which is codedamn. Guys, Mehul likes exploring and exploiting security vulnerabilities in systems and is listed in the Hall of Fame of companies like Google, Microsoft, Sony, and he also runs a very, very successful YouTube channel, which has been viewed more than 18 million times. Before we start with the session, guys, I request you all to post any questions that you have in the Q&A box on the right-hand side. Mehul will take as many questions as possible. And I think without any further ado, we should get right into the topic of discussion at hand. So Mehul, over to you. Please take this forward.
Thank you so much, Vibhor, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm super grateful and super delighted to have been invited for the stage, and I would want to deliver as much value as I can in this 45 minute talk. So I'll start by sharing my screen and taking you through a very simple journey of becoming a full stack developer in 2021. So let's start with what exactly is a full stack developer, right? There are a lot of definitions. If you go to Google, you're going to see a lot of content. You should learn this, you should learn that. But what does it exactly take to become a full stack developer? So before we get into the presentation, I would just like to quickly go through why I am eligible for this and why you should probably listen to me. So I have been a full stack developer myself, I consider that. And I have been coding for almost 7-8 years now. I started back in 2013 when I was in class 8th, 7th. Around that time, I started with blogs and got into web development that way when I wanted to customize my own blogs. And since then, I've been trying to learn on my own. So exploring stuff is one of my powers, which I like to do a lot. I have been freelancing for a very long time in that duration itself. So I was an active freelancer on Fiverr. I'm not really freelancing these days, but I used to do a lot of external projects, which really helps to build the perspective of industry work, right? How people need and how people require you to work on real world projects. I'm also a WWDC 19 scholar for Apple. So Apple selects a bunch of students from some countries and they sponsor your travel, everything for the conferences which they held in San Jose every year. I also run a YouTube channel, just like Vibhor said, and I also run codedamn.com as a startup at the moment. So let's start with what exactly is full stack, right? So what I like to consider full stack is in the form of layers. So when you see web development, when you see a website in general or a web application, which you think could be complicated, complex, or sophisticated in the sense that you know that some backend processing is required, you have a front end. For example, take an example of Google, right? So in very simple terms, if you try to break down Google search engine itself, you have at least 3 layers in there, right? The first layer is the front end, where you see what is actually on the website. You see that the logo is centered. You see when you start typing on the Google homepage, you start getting results immediately. So that is made possible with JavaScript. JavaScript is trying to make calls to backend and so on and so forth. The next layer is backend, right? So the backend are the actual computers, are the actual powerful servers which Google is running in order to communicate those results to your computer, right? And the third one is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is basically the underlying computers and underlying resources which Google or any other company, as a matter of fact, uses to deliver that content to you. Now, this infrastructure is, again, all of these are critical parts of web development. But as full stack developers, we usually focus on these two layers itself, the front end and the back end. Infrastructure and CI/CD and stuff like this usually is considered part of DevOps. But as a full stack developer, I believe that if you're able to manage infrastructure to some extent, you truly become independent, in the sense that now you as a single person are able to deploy applications end to end completely and manage them, own them, the whole vertical tech stack. So we're going to touch a little bit on infrastructure, but won't really go that much deep. But the focus would remain on front end and back end. So I'm going to start in the reverse order. So I'm going to start with the layer one as the infrastructure. Why? Because that's how you start when setting up something. So you could develop an application right away. You could do that, but when you're taking things to production, the first thing you need to do is set up infrastructure, right? Now, a lot of platforms like Heroku and Vercel, for example, make it extremely easy to skip this part. But if you're on AWS or Google Cloud, or as a matter of fact, any other cloud provider, which is infrastructure as a service, not platform as a service, you need to know a little bit about this, spinning up your own EC2 instances or Elastic Beanstalk, doing this stuff on S3. So things like these, you should be aware about them. So mostly what infrastructure involves is managing your servers or databases or even serverless, right? If you're running, for example, AWS Lambdas. So this is a service which helps you, or which enables you to run a piece of code without actually managing about the underlying servers. So it's a very useful thing if you know how to use it, but you don't really have to learn them in order to become, or in order to be called as a full stack developer. Then deploying an applications on cloud provider is also one of the things which I believe comes under infrastructure. Now, this could be platform as a service thing as well. Taking an example of Heroku. Heroku makes it extremely easy to deploy applications. I'm sure a lot of people might have used the CLI version of Heroku and pushing the updates through a Git repository. So that's another example. These are a few mix of cloud providers which are infrastructure as a service as well as platform as a service. So if you take an example of AWS, you're going to see that AWS pretty much is both infrastructure as a service for some things, like you have access to raw servers, EC2 and Elastic Beanstalk and stuff like this. But it is also platform as a service because you have access to services like simple queue service and so on. So just to summarize the slide in a one sentence and a two sentence, you as a full stack developer should be comfortable with at least one of these platforms, Heroku, DigitalOcean, something, because at the end of the day, you have to deploy your application somewhere, right? And in order to deploy it to production, in order to get that URL, you need to use some third-party service. Now, you cannot really set up your own data centers and everything. That is both inconvenient and not really practical in 2021. So we all use existing cloud hosting providers and all that stuff. But that means that you should be fairly comfortable with at least one of these services. Because if you are, then for the most part, you can now focus your learnings and you can now focus all your time on actually the application layer, on actually learning stuff. So what I usually recommend people is, and in no specific order, I mean, this could come later as well, but try to go ahead and learn about the singular service as well. So it might be DigitalOcean, it might be Azure, it might be Heroku. So it's up to you. Which one do you consider as something which you would like to learn, right? The next layer is, after infrastructure, what comes is backend, right? So your infrastructure is actually hosting your backend in a lot of cases. So your backend consists of the business logic. So by business logic, what I mean is that a lot of things are sensitive in the sense that you do not want them to expose to the front end, that is the end user. You don't really want to expose your API keys. You don't really want to expose your secrets. You don't really want to expose how a particular algorithm is working, for example, in your organization. So all of that stuff goes in your backend servers, right? For example, like authentication of users is one thing, processing sensitive data if you are accepting payments on your website, if you're doing any sort of work where you don't really want a user to see how it is happening, you do it on the back end, right? So sending assets, pages to front end is also the job of backend. So whenever you visit google.com, for example, either a CDN is just a special server which just sends you static files, right? So by static files, I just mean files which are not computed on every run. So a CDN does that job, or a backend server can do it as well. So the job of a backend is pretty much communicate with the end user computer, right? And the infrastructure obviously hosts all the backend code and everything. So it's like a bridge between your infrastructure and front end, right? So I like to think backend. A lot of times I like to think backend as firmware as well in your computer. So you have the hardware, you have the software. You can think of software as your own systems, hardware as the infrastructure, and backend is more like a firmware, which allows the communication between your infrastructure, which is in place, and the clients which are trying to get information from your website. Then finally, you also have a layer 3 as a front end. So this is the most interesting part in the sense that people see this on their browsers, right? So whenever somebody's writing example.com and they hit enter, whatever processing happens, that happens maybe in a different country altogether. It's not even from your country, but it takes a couple of milliseconds and you get back your page. But whatever you get back, then that is parsed by the browsers, and browsers are some of the most sophisticated programs which we have available right now. So browsers do all that parsing, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and present you with a nice UI which you see on your screens. So if you type in facebook.com, you see all the logos and all the navigation bars aligned, all the buttons are there. So that's actually a source code file sent by Facebook's backend servers, which is hosted on Facebook's infrastructure. And then you as an end user see that because your browser is able to understand what the website is saying, right? Again, it consists of UI, UX, interactivity, and all that stuff. This HTML, CSS, JavaScript is the core integral part of front end. And if you want to become a front end developer, at least these three things are the bare minimum you need to know, and in fact, even master if you want to become a good developer along the way. And frameworks and UI libraries are all also there to help you boost your productivity, assist you to make much faster changes and iterate in a much faster way. So the question now becomes that how you can start. I mean, these all three layers are all fine and cool, but how should you actually start to learn or get into full stack development? My take is actually starting reverse. Obviously that makes sense. You should not really just go ahead and jump to AWS and start figuring it out. You should start with front end, that is layer 3, then move on to back end, and then take a look at infrastructure, how you can host it. Then there are a few concepts of fixed versus replaceable tech, which is what I like to call it. So think of fixed tech in the sense that you need to learn these technologies irrespective of what happens, right? Because there is no replacement for these technologies, or these are, for example, some of the best available options which you have. And we'll see soon what I mean by that. Most of the things are replaceable, especially when it comes to backend and infrastructure. But with front end, you are pretty much stuck with HTML, CS, and JavaScript for the time being. So let's start with front end as the layer 3. So you see that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are these 2 to 3 technologies which you need to know, which you need to learn, irrespective of whatever you want to do. Whether if you want to become even a front-end developer, you need to know these technologies. Why? Because the browsers only support JavaScript, especially JavaScript as the scripting language right now. This might change in the near future with WASM and WebAssembly coming to the browsers, but it's still a very, very long way to go about. So your best bet right now is to start learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if you want to become a web developer of any sort. I know people who are experts in Python and try to do everything in Python. But if you want to get into web development, it is better that you start learning JavaScript. Although you can code up backends and everything in Python and Rust and Ruby and all that stuff, if you're writing any sort of front-end application, any sort of UI, you cannot really avoid JavaScript in 2021. I mean, you can technically, but then you will have pages which are mostly boring and non-interactive, right? And feels like 25-ish, right? So don't really want to feel your website like that. So JavaScript is the place to be. Then I would say Chrome DevTools or Firefox DevTools or things like these sort. These are also some of the important things which I believe a lot of people miss on when they're starting their careers as front-end developers or they want to become front-end developers. Because if you don't really know how to debug effectively, if you don't really know how to reverse engineer what you have done, you will spend a lot of time playing around and figuring out the console statements and hackish way of debugging stuff and just sitting in front of a computer all day long trying to figure out what is going on wrong. So I would say that this is like a almost a mandatory step if you want to become a good developer. Now, sure, you can replace Chrome DevTools with Firefox DevTools or your favorite browser DevTools, but you gotta be learning some sort of way of debugging things at front end level, right? For backend as well, you have debuggers and everything, so I probably would not mention it there. But debugging is an important concept in programming, and not a lot of tutorials or a lot of courses right now feature or pay close attention to this. But as developers, as self-learners, if you're one of the self-learners out there, I would say that this is something you should and you definitely should consider when you're trying to learn new technologies, when you're trying to get into front-end development. So that's one thing I consider really important. Then coming to frameworks, which is more of a opinion now, these things are replaceable mostly, right? So you can replace, for example, if you're a Vue developer or an Angular JS developer or an Angular developer, no who's Angular JS developer these days, but if you're any sort of developer for any framework or if you like some specific framework, feel free to replace it. But in today's world or in today's standards, what has happened is that if you want to develop anything a little bit sophisticated, medium to large size applications, you should be learning a framework. And I get a lot of questions. I'll get this asked a lot of times that why do we need to learn a framework? Why can't we just do everything in simple JavaScript? Well, you can, but eventually you will see that you end up creating a framework of your own because there is so much repetitive stuff when you do create a new website, when you do create a new web application. There are so many times you would be writing the same code again and again. So you will end up creating your own framework. So why not just go ahead and use something which is already well maintained by open source, especially with React, you have Facebook backing it. Angular is backed by Google. So there are actual good developers who are helping you maintain a framework itself. So why not just go ahead and use that? So again, use of framework or use of things like Next.js or React, I believe, in my opinion, should come out as something which you need, right? It should not be to put on your resume, although it will work that way as well. But if you're truly trying to become front-end developer just out of interest, or if you want to get to know web in a better way, or if you want to develop applications in a better way, I believe that you should spend a lot of time actually with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then move on to things like React or Next.js or any sort of ecosystem technology as well, whenever you feel that you have the need for it. That's how I learned. That's how I learned technologies, because I would usually work on whatever I have so far, and then I would see that okay, this stuff is now taking me a lot of time to iterate and reiterate. Is there a better tool out there which can help me? So that's how I explored and discovered most of the tech stack which I work with. So I'm going to eventually share my tech stack. So these are things of which I know and I use in my own projects. So that's why I'm able to confidently talk about them. I can't really confidently talk about Angular or Vue and its ecosystem because I'm not in touch with that. I'm a React developer myself. I have used React for a long time. Recently shifted to Next.js as well. So that's what I can recommend, and that's what I can say about these things. Then, at least for front end, I would say that if you want to become, again, this is uh, some people agree, some people don't really agree, some people just really like vanilla JavaScript, but I do believe that if you can, you should go ahead and learn TypeScript. TypeScript will make your life much easier as a developer, although there's a learning curve to it. But if you learn TypeScript, you will see that your code is much safe in the sense that you are able to ship it to production confidently. And why is that? Because TypeScript brings the benefits of static typing and dynamic typing together. For people who don't know static typing programming languages are like Java or C or C++, where you actually specify the types of the variables which you're declaring. You know what a function would return, and you basically have an idea of how the code is working. Dynamic typing is more like the programming language is figuring out everything on the runtime. So at the end of the day, JavaScript is still a dynamic typing language, but TypeScript allows you to use it in a much restricted and a much constrained way, which is more than often good enough for developers, right? Because as developers, we want power, but JavaScript just gives you too much power in order to shoot yourself in the foot. So you don't really want that situation, and especially with larger code bases, I can tell you that TypeScript helps you to keep your mind sane, because if you want to do any refactoring, or if you want to do anything at all which you think might result in breaking of 100 other files, then TypeScript really makes it easier to debug and makes it visible, at least, that these are the problems. Sure, it can be painful at some times, but I do believe that it really pays off the learning curve which it comes with. So I would say that this is one of the fixed things. And definitely, if you continue to use JavaScript on backend, for example, in the form of Node.js or Next.js, you will realize how useful and how productive TypeScript becomes once you learn that. Then again, this is related to the tech stack which I know. So it could be fixed, it could be replaceable, depending on how you want to proceed. But I do believe that you also need a sort of a UI system in place with your front end, right? So you don't really want to be someone who does not know CSS. That's absolutely fine. You should learn CSS and in depth and layouts and properties and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, when you're creating applications for production, or when you're doing an internship, or when you're doing a freelance project, you don't really want to, just start working from the absolute scratch and just, be someone who's not using existing systems in place. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of effort put out by developer community in order to build these awesome UI systems, guidelines, libraries like Material UI and Tailwind CSS and Bootstrap as well. A lot of people, I believe, know Bootstrap much better than these two things. It falls in the same category, right? So try to use these existing systems, built on top of these existing systems. And what I have seen works best is that people stick to their favorite UI system. For example, for some of them it's Bootstrap, for others I have seen is Tailwind. For me, it's kind of like mix of both Material UI and Tailwind. So figure out a UI system which you like the most and which you are most familiar with, and you're able to create layouts and stuff with it. And you're going to see that you will become much more productive when you're creating front ends, right? You will be able to very quickly bootstrap and iterate over those layouts and over those files. To be honest, what I have seen over the last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years is that most of the tech works, right? Most of the technologies will work just fine. It's more about you as a developer. Do you have enough expertise or enough domain knowledge or enough knowledge about that particular tech stack which you're using? That is in the 99.99% cases the bottleneck, right? So you're going to hear people that, oh, Angular is bad, and oh, Angular is sophisticated, or maybe like, oh, I don't really like Vue, or I don't know, React sucks, or something like that. In those cases, it's not really the fault of framework, because I can show you people who are using Angular in a highly professional and a very efficient and performant way, right? I can show you people who are using React. I can show you people who are using Vue. So if everyone is able to use everything in a highly performant way, then figure out whose mistake it is. It's probably you. It's probably you because you do not have the experience, or you do not have cleared that fundamental concepts or fundamental basics of the framework yet. So the technology works, everything works. It's just that what works for you. I cannot create an application in Angular which is somewhat sophisticated unless I learn more about the framework, right? So that doesn't mean that Angular is bad. It means that I need to spend more time with the tech stack which I want um, for me, right? And for me, I have chosen React as my primary framework. So for you, it could be Angular. For you, it could be Vue. Similarly, for layouts as well, for you, it could be Material UI. For you, it could be Bootstrap. But doesn't mean that you pretty much always have to stick with it. That's one thing. And secondly, that doesn't mean that you are not free to explore other things. So feel free to try to explore other things as well. That's how you usually learn new stuff. Then again, continuing with my own tech stack of React and Next.js, these are a few things which I believe could be really helpful. So Tailwind Material UI for UI building and everything, and use SWR, React Query. And if you're using GraphQL, then Apollo GraphQL as well, which I did not mention here, for data fetching, right? So data fetching, we all know, API endpoints, we all have created those simple applications where you just fetch some data from an API, display it, those movie trackers and Pokemon applications, stuff like this. So libraries like use SWR and React Query, what they do is that they make your life easier in the sense that all the asynchronous loading and processing and fetching is abstracted away from you. All the caching and invalidation and revalidation of stuff that somebody, for example, has opened your website for 7 hours now, and now the data has changed on the backend. So you want to process that and you want to get the fresh data back again. So how do you do that? You can do that manually by maintaining your own cache and everything. But like I said, you should be able to focus more on the business logic and the application itself than micromanaging these small things. So for them, try to figure out the best tool in the ecosystem, the best tool in the industry, and use that. And for React, at least I know React Query and used SWR are two of the best libraries out there in terms of data fetching. If you want to do any sort of API manipulation or calls or everything, if you do not know what you're doing, you most likely need to go with React Query, right? Or use SWR. So that's one strong suggestion again. Then moving on to backend, once you're done with the Chrome DevTools part and the UI building part and the data fetching part and all that stuff, there might be a couple of more things here and there in terms of building your own ecosystem of technologies. But once you've figured out that much stuff, I mean, this is pretty much what you can use in order to build a good enough front-end application, right? You might need a few libraries here and there, some npm packages. That's completely fine, but more or less this is the tech stack which I can use to create a very solid front-end application, and so can you, right? So that's what I wanted to say. Then of course on the backend part, you need and you can use a bunch of different technologies, right? But starting off with a few things, I believe you should be comfortable enough with CLI. GUI, graphical user interface, is not an option. It's not an option. If you're a developer, you will realize that you will become much more productive, much more efficient as a programmer when you shift a lot of your operations to CLI, command line interface, right? And the two most popular shells which we have right now are Bash, which is pretty much found everywhere, and SH as well, which is a uh, I won't really say similar to Bash because it has much less features and functionalities, but it is again a universal sort of shell. So learn about CLIs, learn about how you can manage stuff with Linux, how the memory management works, and basics of computers as well. Because learning about Linux is more about learning about basics of computers. If you're even if you're getting into backend in the sort of containerization and running Docker and everything, you need to have that knowledge of processors and cores and stuff like that. So I would say like figuring out not that much stuff, right away, but starting off with just the basics of Linux or basics of command line would really help you to work with actual servers as well. Because irrespective of what you're using currently on your systems, whether it's Ubuntu, Mac OS, Windows, whatever it is, very high chances are there. I mean, almost everyone uses Linux on the cloud, right? If you're using Windows on the cloud, then either you have a very specific requirement for Windows application, which can only be done on a Windows server, or B, you are just doing it wrong, right? You should be using Linux servers on the cloud, and mostly everyone uses that. So if you're using Linux servers, if you're setting up Linux, then if something goes wrong, or if you want to set up something, or if you want to debug something, the first thing is that you should know how to browse your computer, right? Think of how what would happen if you one day you were not able to even start your computer, which is at your home, and you don't really know what a mouse is, what a keyboard is, and I mean you cannot really use your computer at all in that case. So that's pretty much similar to what happens when you get a computer on cloud. If you don't know Linux, if you don't know your way around terminal, you're pretty much stuck. If you don't know how to SSH, you're stuck, right? You cannot really use that computer which has been allocated to you because there's no physical access. You cannot really go in a different room and plug in that computer. So that's why I believe learning about Linux is a good way to start. And one way to do that for Windows guys, you can go ahead and install WSL to get you an experience for Linux and all that stuff. For Mac OS and Ubuntu, I do believe that you guys can start away for not really Ubuntu, but any Linux distribution. You can start away from your terminal itself and start there. Setting up EC2 servers, not really EC2 here. I should not have written EC2. It could be pretty much anything. EC2 is specific name to AWS, but it could be a DigitalOcean droplet. It could be a Google Cloud instance. It could be pretty much anything, right? But infrastructure as a service in its very fundamental form is a cloud computer, is a computer which is managed by a provider, and you can SSH into it and use it. That is, I believe, the fundamental unit of cloud computing. Every other platform as a service or every other automated thing is built on those EC2 or on those computers. So setting up a simple server on the cloud, which you do not own, which an organization, which a different company or a cloud provider owns, is the best thing you can learn in order to set up a website, because you then learn about IP address which has been allocated with it. You learn a little bit about computer networking. So I mean, with clouds, when you get into clouds, there's a lot of stuff which you automatically start learning along the way when you're figuring out stuff. And this again, this is not really I won't really say this is part of backend, more on the side of DevOps and deployment, all that stuff. But I still like to consider this in the backend development itself, because this is more or less a mandatory step if you want to take your application live. As a solo person, as somebody who tried to figure out and learn a lot of stuff on my own, I had no choice but to learn this stuff, right? Because I'd started at a time when I was not a part of a company, or, I did not have people who were working with me. So first thing that I had to figure this out on my own. But secondly, I enjoyed the whole process. doing this, right? So that's also one thing which is important, which we'll come to, that you should be enjoying this stuff. I mean, sure, the horrors of programming, and we all know that getting stuck on a bug for hours and even days, it's there. But at the end, you should be satisfied and you should be happy and you should be looking forward to programming. That's how you know that it is made for you. Otherwise, either you are just rushing too much, or it's probably not a good field for you. I mean, let's face it, not everyone should be a programmer, or not everyone wants to become one. But unless you spend a lot of time with it, unless you see the ins and outs, you wouldn't really know. But anyway, coming back to that later on, with backend, again, backend DevOps, stuff like this, containerization is a huge thing these days. Running applications in different containers, because containers are cheap to start and restart, and if they go rogue, delete them, kill them, bring them back again to life. So that's an important concept to know. Docker is one of the most popular things out there in terms of containerization. So I would recommend kind of going into that route as well, but not straightforward. Don't really worry about that. You should not be worrying about EC2s and Dockers and Bash CLI right away. What you should be worried about, or what should you be learning, the first step in the backend is a programming language, right? So once you have learned with front end, once you know how to develop decent front end UIs and everything, once you have learned a little bit about how to communicate with backend, with APIs and stuff like this, I believe that you should learn a programming language which you can use to program backends. Now, this could be Python, this could be Rust, this could be Ruby, this could be PHP, this could be anything you want. I start with Node.js because I, for some reason, picked up Node.js. It's nothing specific. I started with PHP, my career, in the sense that I started with WordPress, which got me into PHP. Then, I worked with PHP so much. I worked a lot with PHP in the terms of connecting databases and all that stuff, but I just did not like it eventually. So I had to make a shift to Node.js. Then again, the same things with which happens with dynamically typed language. I did not like the false sense of security and the things which come with Node.js, but TypeScript then enabled me to have much confidence and greater confidence in the sense of writing backends. But again, like I said, TypeScript is not replaceable in the sense, but it is optional, right? So yeah, I mean, if given an option, I should say that you should definitely go ahead and consider learning this with your backends. Obviously, with Node.js, you can't really learn Python and TypeScript. That wouldn't make sense, but figure out your own ecosystem around the tech which you're learning, right? If you're learning Python or if you're learning Rust, I have no idea and I have no knowledge as per se to give you. I can only tell you about Node.js, TypeScript, and that experience because that's who I am. So things like that. GraphQL and REST is also an important concept, and you should pick one out of them. So REST is more of an API layer and API structure which you're probably familiar with. So, for example, when you're writing a fetch request on front end, you do fetch API v1 something something, right? That is most probably REST, right? REST is more of an guideline, and you can say it's a guideline which developers and backend people tend to follow. That your status code should be 200 if the response is successful. Your status code should be 404 if the resource is not found. Your status code should be in 500 lines if it is a server error. So stuff like this, right? GraphQL, on the other hand, does not follow that REST architecture or REST guidelines, in the sense that it usually exposes a singular endpoint, probably like something like /GraphQL or /API/GraphQL. And all of the communication happens over post request. So that's something you can explore later down the line as well. But I started with REST, and I recommend starting with REST as well, because GraphQL, let's be honest, is a little bit tedious to set up and get right, especially when you're using TypeScript as well. Then things get very nasty with GraphQL. So Anyway, I would say focusing on a backend language like Node.js and Python and everything, and creating REST API endpoints from it. Get method, post method, put method, figuring out the basics of HTTP as well, which is super important in the sense that you should be able to understand how the backend sends the response to front end, how you can debug those things on front end with Chrome DevTools, Networks tab, how you can inspect what's coming from backend, what are headers, what are cookies, um, what are status codes, what is a URL. So very basic, very fundamental stuff like this. If you do not know answers to these, and if you're rushing your way up in the hierarchy, you will get stuck eventually, and you will have to come back to these concepts later down the line. So that's why I say spend a little bit more time on fundamentals and basics, and make sure if even if you don't want to spend it right away, make sure you remember to come back to it, and make sure you do not create that false sense of how do I say this, false sense of accomplishment in the mind that yes, you have learned, or yes, you have created, or yes, you have mastered this concept. You never really master anything at all. I am still learning a lot of new stuff every single day for each of the technologies which I have listed. So always be in a learner mode. That is like the, if you want to just take one thing from this talk, is that always be in the learner mode, because the moment you try to get into that mastery mode where you think that you know it all, that will be the end of your growth, in the sense that you will not be able to grow anymore, because now you have hit your peak. So always being in learner mode means that you're always open to learning new things, new concepts. So that's how you will keep on learning. Then again, I have one small recommendation in terms of data validation. Joey is one library which I use with Node.js. I'm not sure if it is available for other platforms. It might be not, I'm not very sure. But this is a very good library in terms of data validation. In terms of backend, when you're writing backends and coding up that, you are also responsible for securing those systems against attacks, right? So most of the attacks, I would say, you know, I won't really put a number on this, but I do believe that most of the attacks happen because of user sanitization missing, right, in the code base. Now, it could be either on front end or back end. It's usually less about misconfigured servers and more about, just the backend developers not parsing or sanitizing the user inputs properly. So data sanitization and data validation is a huge thing if you're a backend developer, which again is surprisingly never talked a lot about when you're learning backend. So make sure you keep an eye on that. Make sure you are thinking as a hacker, as somebody who's reverse engineering your systems as well, because someday it might just come handy. So again, just coming back at the end to the infrastructure layer, servers and serverless differences, and when to use what is super important, super critical. Sometimes it can save you a lot of trouble and a lot of time. But honestly, I would say that if you're starting off as somebody who's new, always try to go with servers, right? Serverless is also server, but just not visible to you. So I would say that if you really want to learn cloud computing and everything, try to start with an EC2 instance, or try to start with a bare metal server, which has nothing installed, pre-installed. So you're working with CLI, you get that experience and everything, and you figure out everything from that point onwards. Serverless can come later. Lambdas and S3s and all that stuff is all cool, but you can learn them along the way. And once you know fundamentals, once you know the basics, you can not only just learn them in a much efficient way, but you will be able to appreciate as well how they are working and how they're looking like, right? So that's again one thing I wanted to say. Again, these are some of the serverless things where you don't really have to manage the underlying servers. And pretty much most of the cloud providers support a lot of serverless things. I think DigitalOcean does not do that in terms of Lambdas and SQS and stuff like that. But AWS is there, Google Cloud is there, Azure is also there. So you can take a look at that. Again, things like SaaS, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service are also important concepts. So you would usually see that interesting observation, not really that much interesting, but you'll see that when you're managing a lower level of abstraction, that is, the lowest level is infrastructure as a service, where AWS gives you raw servers to manage, right? So that's mostly the cheapest option available. Then as we move up to platform as a service, software as a service, the things get expensive because now they are managed, right? So even in terms of cost and even in terms of learning, the cheaper service you use, I mean, the cheaper in the sense that infrastructure is, as a service is the cheapest out there, the harder it is to manage and set up. But that also means that it involves more of learning compared to SaaS or PaaS, right? So take a look at Heroku, for example. Sure, Heroku offers you a free tire, but their next tire, I guess, starts from $7 a month. So if you're using that platform as a service, you're paying $7 a month and you're not learning a lot, right? And that could be a good thing. I mean, as a developer, you mostly want to manage the business logic and that stuff. But if you want to get into cloud, if you want to learn about servers, you probably want to start with infrastructure as a service, right? Because that will help you, that will enable you to learn about infrastructures in general, how to manage servers, how to make sure your instance is not crashing, it does not run out of memory, stuff like that. So pay close attention to things which are hard, because hard things actually teach you much more and much better in a much better way compared to the easy stuff. But again, it depends on that you want to learn that thing. I mean, if you just want to get that application live, then of course it's a much better idea to go with Heroku or something managed than compared to just figuring out servers all day long. That's something you should keep in mind. Then again, one thing I usually see among people is that they try to learn a lot of stuff together and they try to learn everything at once, which is a huge mistake in my opinion, because you cannot really do so many context switches when you're learning, especially when you're learning, because your brain has limited power, limited capacity every single day. So you probably want to focus it on a specific tech which you're learning, a specific thing which you're learning. Why? Because if you try to do a lot of context switches, not only you will confuse yourself, but a lot of times you'll give up in the sense that this is just too much. So don't try to learn everything at once. Try to give every single layer which we talked about a lot of time. And also, that being said, also don't really get stuck on a single layer. So if you're doing front end, it's okay. I mean, you can do front end a lot, but understand when it's time to move on to backends, right? You don't really want to be the greatest front end developer ever and then not know backend, given that you want to become full stack, right? That's what the talk is about. So if you want to become full stack, don't really get stuck on a single layer forever, because you need to be at least become a jack of all trades quickly, and you eventually want to be a master of one. But a full stack person is basically jack of all trades, right? You don't really know cloud computing or back end or front end in absolute depths unless you are working for years with that. Then doing is greater than learning. That's 100% true. If you are learning from video tutorials, if you're just watching back, taking up a Udemy course, YouTube playlist, whatever it is, and not doing, then, and if you can do something about it, then of course you should be doing it. For example, just watching playlist of DigitalOcean or AWS setup is not the way to go about that. You should be doing it. You should be creating your own droplets. You should be configuring the network access. You should be considering the security groups, stuff like this. You should be doing it on your own. That's much better than learning. However, learning is again much better than doing nothing. So if you're just sitting back and not doing and just wasting your time, it's probably much better in terms of time usage to just pick up a video series or pick up a blog article, pick up something which you want to learn, and just not do anything at all. And finally, opportunities as a developer, which I believe is a huge industry, as a huge thing. and I can share my experience and my opportunities. At the moment, I have been a WWDC scholar just because I know web development. Trust me, I'm not an Apple developer. I don't really know the ecosystem around Apple and Swift UI. I was able to pick up that technology in the 10 days period and just figure out everything because I had prior experience. I had past experience with programming, which really helped me. So anyway, there are a bunch of opportunities. You can create simple web applications, websites of your own. I remember I created, um, it's not strictly web development, but I plugged in my Raspberry Pi with my old television and used Raspberry as a remote media server sort of thing, which was controlled by my mobile phone, which was linked to the home Wi-Fi network, and it enabled me to pretty much use Raspberry as a Chromecast, right? So you can send a movie, you can send a picture to the Raspberry, and it will be displayed on the TV. So things like these, you can come up with something interesting of your own, interesting projects, interesting concepts, and the best part is you can execute them as developers, as programmers. You don't really just have to just imagine how the world would look like. You can actually create stuff out of thin air, which is just beautiful as developers. Freelancing on Fiverr platform like these will actually help you make a side earning, a side gig as well if you're doing it right. So yeah, I mean, I did it for the longest time in my development, learning, and career history. So that is definitely out there. The opportunity to earn as developers is real. You probably know that programmers are one of the most paid people on the planet right now. So that's also there. Then as you level up as developers, you can also pick up more sophisticated projects, more complete projects, which are, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks long, and charge much more than that. Not just $5, $10, but $500,000, $1,500 as well. Internships as startups is also an opportunity, especially if you're working just as a developer. So that's also there. Jobs at medium-sized companies. Companies are always looking for full stack developers and people. If you're, for example, if you're in the cloud industry, you can help them reduce their cloud bills. If you're a full stack backend developer, if you know your way around those, you can help them there. So companies do look for people like us. Then ability to deploy full stack applications and complete pipelines is also, again, something which can be the next version of the first point, that is simple website of your own. But now you have the ability to manage the whole infrastructure and tech stack as well as a developer. And then finally, building your own companies, because I personally believe, this is my personal belief, that developers, if they're able to develop that business sense of mind, you guys should be uh, the people who are actually creating products and creating companies. I don't really see why more developers are not founders and CEOs and working on their own companies and products, because as developers, you will have the ability to execute your vision. You will have the ability to determine the product, the health, the state of the product, and not only just determine, but actually take it forward as well. So that's what I'm trying to do with codedamn.com, the codedamn platform, which we talked about in the about section. It's a platform for people to learn coding interactively, hands-on, and that's what I have developed with everything I knew, everything I learned over the last few years. So I do believe that developers have the potential to do pretty much everything from business to actual deployment, all the coding and stuff. It's just that you need to get your mindset right. And one quick thing, if you're not having fun, you will give up. So make sure you take it slow, but make sure you're having fun along the way. So that's an important part, that you should be enjoying the journey, right? So because you will figure out that one day that when you have completed that project, when you have completed that thing and deployed it, it's not as much fun now to see that project. So you should be enjoying the journey, the part of the process, because that's what will keep you going. And I would also like to show a very relevant and relatable quote from Linus. Most good programmers do programming not because they are expected to get paid, or they're not really into development because they want to get paid or anything, but it's really fun to program. So if you're someone who picked up programming just out of interest and just out of curiosity, just make sure you're having a lot of fun and you're enjoying your way around, because there are a lot of other ways to earn in the world and in life as well, but programming is one of the ways where if you're able to have fun and if you're able to learn in an interactive way, in a better way, then it could be really rewarding with that. And yeah, that's pretty much it for a quick full stack presentation. Thank you so much. You can reach out to me. You have this presentation live as well on fs.mehulmohan.com if you want to visit this presentation. And I would love to take up any questions if anyone has anything I can answer.
Great, Mehul. Mehul, I think we have some really great questions lined up. I'll get right into them. We'll try to take as many as possible. So the first question, says, can you actually tell us how many languages should one know to become a full stack developer? Like, what is the minimum amount?
So the minimum amount I would say is that for front end, need to know HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We discussed about that. Then on the back end, you can pretty much make use of the JavaScript knowledge which you got on front end in terms of Node.js. At least that's what I did. So I would say that you can say Node.js is a different programming language, but not really. It's a different runtime. So it shares a lot of common things with JavaScript. So I'll keep that count to 3: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And yeah, I mean, if you want to throw in TypeScript there, you are free to do that. That will make it 4, but not really. You can just go with JavaScript as well. And once you know the backend, once you know Node.js programming and Express and working with some of the common libraries, that's all you need, honestly, in order to become a minimal full stack developer, because you can now code front ends, you can now code backends. And once you have enough understanding about deploying it to Heroku or any such platform, then you can create basic full applications yourself. So I would say the minimal count is 3, but it is usually not about languages. It's more about becoming familiar with the ecosystem of technologies available.
All right, great. Okay, so the next question says, what do you think about the approach of databases as a layer to store the data of a website?
Yeah, absolutely. You would have to learn databases and some sort of NoSQL or SQL database in order to be a backend developer. I think we did not go into that depth in the backend developer presentation, but databases is an integral part for your application. And honestly, you need to know about a lot of database concepts. You're expected, you think about that you should know a lot of things in databases when you're working, that there's all ACID properties and everything. But in reality, when you're working with real world applications, you just need to know about a bunch of things, indexes being the most important if you're working with high volume data. And that's it. That's all you need to know in terms of databases, that you have a table, row table, column mechanism for SQL databases and a document mechanism for NoSQL. And once you understand that concepts, once you realize those things, you should be good.
Great. Okay, Mehul, so I have a couple of questions. I'll sort of club all of those questions together, right? I think they all revolve around the same thing. So Aman, asks that, I come from an automation QA background. I want to switch to web development. I have more than 6 years of experience. Then there's somebody who asked, I've been doing manual testing and automation testing for the last 3 or 4 years. Even I want to go into web development. And I think adding to that, there is another guy who asks that, I'm starting my web development journey. I really want to go, I need all the perfect resources. And how can codedamn sort of help me, take a good move and go in the right direction?
So with codedamn, you will see a lot of content is out there in terms of interactive videos and hands-on practice. It is there, but there's one more thing which I really like about codedamn platform is that we run a very specific duration accelerator programs. The front end accelerator program, for example, which just started on codedamn, where I will help you in the next 30, 45, 60 days, whatever the duration of the program is. And then we go over through some of the important topics which we just discussed in depth. For example, React and its ecosystem and stuff like that. So what I can recommend is, if you're not participating in accelerators or anything like this, if even if you want to do it on your own, of course you have the option to go to codedamn and get into one of the accelerators. But if not, then try putting a time constraint, a time limit on your head, because these fields are something which can, if you allow, you can just let them take forever to learn, right? So you can learn front end development in 20 years, as well as in 2 years, as well as in 8 months, right? So you want to make sure that you have a deadline at your head, you have specific goals which are hitting weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. So having that discipline, having that momentum created is pretty important.
All right, wonderful. So Mehul, it's two. I think we're running a little behind, but I'll take one more question, right? And I'll again club two questions together. What, according to you, is a full stack data scientist, right? And can you say that full stack developers make better future product managers?
Okay, so I wouldn't want to answer about full stack data scientist because I'm not a data scientist and I have no experience what goes in the full stack version of data scientist. So I might want to skip that. But about product managers, I would say that if you know the ins and outs of a technology and tech stack, you could definitely have a better vision, have a clearer vision in terms of product building and in terms of managing the tech stack and communicating ideas in general. Because the more knowledgeable you become, the clearer your mind becomes in terms of what is important, what is not important, and the clearer it becomes to communicate ideas across teams. So I believe that could indirectly help you become a better product manager.
All right, wonderful. Okay, Gaurav, I think we'll take one last question, then we'll sort of bring an end to this session. Gaurav, is asking that I am planning to make a mobile application, and I also want to make a web application, right? Can you talk about what are the least number of items in layer 3 and layer 2 which I have to use?
So for mobile application, there are a bunch of ways to go about. If you're going the all the native way, it's absolutely wonderful. If you're going hybrid way, React Native is there for, Flutter is there for, supporting both sort of devices. But for, like you said, in terms of infrastructure and backend, you pretty much need a common um, thing there, right? You don't really need to code backend differently for mobile. You don't really need to code infrastructure differently for mobile applications. You can use them, in a common way across your web application front ends as well as your mobile applications. So code them once, expose API endpoints both for web applications and mobile applications. And for mobile applications, if you really want to do a lot less work, I mean, I have not really tried it myself, but there are options like React Native Web also available, which compiles your React Native applications to web. So you pretty much write just the code for mobile application once, and then it is available both on Android, iOS, as well as on the web. So there are options like this. Explore them, figure out which one seems most relevant to you, and then use that.
All right, great. So Mehul, it's 2 now. I think we'll have to sort of bring an end to this session. Do you have any closing comments that you'd like to share with the audience here?
So yeah, I would just say, like, as parting words, I would say try to keep your discipline and momentum going up, because that's the most of the deciding factor is in how much time or how much disciplined you are every single day or every single week. Because what I have seen in my experience is that 7 hours of work on a Sunday night is not equal to 1 hour of work every single day. 1 hour of work every single day is much more effective in terms of building that long-term knowledge and in terms of building that experience. So make sure you are consistent, make sure you try to put in effort daily, or at least try to do it daily. And I mean, you would be able to do it eventually if you have interest in programming and if you think it's fun. So keep building, keep trying, and all the best for everyone who's an aspiring developer.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mehul. I think with that, we have to bring an end to an hour of wonderful insights and experiences. Thank you so much, Mehul and codedamn, for
Thank you
collaborating.
so much, Vibhor.
Yeah, and also to all the attendees for staying with us through this 1 hour. Guys, there's a small survey towards the end of the webinar. If you take that survey, it'll help us make necessary improvements towards the end of the webinar. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much, Mehul.